Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 185. You're not ascending to Godhood. You're just dehydrated. Hizashi rode with Izuku and Bakugo in the first ambulance because no one could find the nerve to try to pry the kid's arms from around their shoulders. He was still crying his eyes out and didn't seem aware of his surroundings in the slightest, as he didn't even flinch when Hizashi picked him up. Shota felt like his heart was getting wrenched from his chest for the nth time in the past 2 days as he watched the ambulance peel out of the plaza. He took a steadying breath and reminded himself that Hizashi was with them, and the second ambulance was already screeching to a stop in front of him. He shepherded Shinso into the back of the vehicle and left Hawks to chaperone the remaining uninjured students to the hospital rendezvous. He numbly answered the paramedics' questions as best he could, because Shinso was in too much pain to speak past one-word replies, and he tried his best not to think about All Might. Izuku couldn't handle another loss right now. Hell, the country couldn't handle that loss right now. He thought about Hawks and how the kid was too young to be thrust into the position of the number 2 hero. He thought about what a nightmare it was going to be to have Endeavor as the country's number 1, and he very resolutely did not think about the wretched sobs that were still echoing through his mind. Hizashi was with him. He wasn't alone. He was safe now. He pushed everything to the back of his mind and reminded himself that he still had a job to do. The paramedics had given Shinso some painkillers, and he was waiting for them to kick in. Shota could imagine that his mother was either just as panicked as he was or completely unaware, so he pulled out his phone to fix the one problem he could deal with right now. Aizawa, 9:57 p.m. Your son is fine. I am with him, and we are about to enter triage at Kamino General. Quirk overuse. He explained the bare bones of the situation succinctly. Shinso Kohaku, 9:57 p.m. I'm already here. Uraraka still has his phone. He spared another glance over to Shinso. He was lying back on the stretcher and taking shaky, measured breaths. Tears were streaking down his face, but the blood from his nose had stopped flowing for the most part. Shota wasn't sure if the tears were because of the pain or the situation, but he didn't ask. Shinso was still in no state to talk, and if Shota was being honest with himself, he wasn't either. However, there was another issue he could try his best to mitigate right now. He remembered the way the kid had clung to him after Izuku had been taken, so he reached out and took Shinso's balled-up fist in his hand in hopes of soothing some sort of ache. Shinso squinted at him past the bright fluorescent lights of the ambulance, and his breath hitched painfully before he pried open his stiff fingers enough to hold Shota's own. Everything he did felt like putting a Band-Aid over a bullet wound, but it was all he could do right now. When Shinso squeezed his hand, Shota squeezed back, and they weathered the rest of the short trip in silence. The whole world was bright lights and pain. Izuku didn't even know where the hell he was anymore. All he knew was that everything hurt. He was cold. And All Might was gone. All Might was gone. Kami, All Might was gone. He knew he was crying and clinging onto someone, but he couldn't really remember who it was. What he did know was that someone was trying to pull them away from him, and he didn't like that. Fortunately, they didn't try very hard, and they stopped rather quickly. The air smelled sharp, like alcohol and antiseptic. The scent only served to remind him of how much pain he was in. He needed it to stop. He needed all of this to stop. He needed to get out of wherever the hell here was, and he needed to breathe. Kami, he couldn't freaking breathe. Shota had every intention of seeing Shinso to his mother, but the moment the ambulance doors opened up A rumpled-looking paramedic was ushering him out of the vehicle and away from his student. He recognized him as one of the paramedics who had been with Izuku and Bakugo. Eraserhead, you're needed elsewhere. Follow me, the man said with professional urgency. His heart sank. There was no way he was being pulled away to receive good news. He could see Bakugo being wheeled into the hospital, so Shota could only assume this had something to do with Izuku. Shinso squinted at him again and let go of his hand, so he took that for the dismissal it was. Bakugo was straining his neck to look back toward Izuku, and Shota caught his eye before he disappeared around the corner. The kid looked scared, so he did his best to keep his unease off his face and gave a reassuring nod. He's not sure how successful he was, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. The paramedic led him to the ambulance, where Izuku was still holding on to Hisashi for dear life. His quirk was flaring up in green sparks, and Shota surmised why they needed him here rather quickly. He won't let go of me, and his quirk is out of control. They need to sedate him, but I told them to hold off till you got here. I didn't want to risk anything in an enclosed space. He already sent one paramedic flying into the wall. He didn't even move when it happened. I don't think he noticed he did anything, Hisashi explained the moment they saw him. Yeah, that's what he had figured. Is he hurting you? Shota asked. The silent question of, can I do this gently, went unspoken. No, I'm fine, but he's probably hurting himself if what Bakugo said about his injuries is accurate. All right, gently but quickly. Izuku? He asked as he climbed into the ambulance. The last thing he wanted to do was scare him any more than he already was. He's completely unresponsive, Sho. I don't think anything you say is going to help, Hisashi informed him remorsefully. Shota cringed. He'd been called in to erase children's out-of-control quirks in the past, and it was about a 50-50 chance that they would freak out more rather than calm down when he intervened. He sincerely hoped Izuku would fall into the latter category, but he doubted it. All right, yeah. Shota relented and spared a glance toward the paramedic to ensure they were ready before giving them a countdown. 3, 2, 1. He activated his quirk, and just as he had expected, Izuku went from tense to stiff as a board, and the shaky breaths he was taking stopped altogether. The paramedic wasted no time shoving a needle into the meat of Izuku's thigh, depressing the plunger and stepping back as quickly as possible. Izuku's breathing came back in shuddering, panicked heaves. He still looked like he didn't have the faintest idea where he was, but he didn't seem to have noticed the needle or the paramedic either. Shota kept his quirk activated even as Izuku started to hyperventilate and clutch at his chest. No, please, no. I need to see them again. I need to see if he's there, he stuttered out, his words coming out slow and lethargic before he slumped bonelessly against Hisashi. Hisashi's brow was furrowed, and they were biting down on a frown. They twisted their fingers into the mass of tangled, greasy curls on top of Izuku's head and planted a kiss on his hairline before they let the paramedics take over. They were careful as they hauled him up onto a stretcher, though that did little to reassure him. He had to stand back and watch Izuku get taken away from him again. He already felt sick for using his quirk on him, for letting Hisashi hold him while he checked on everyone else, for leaving him in Kamino for that damn press conference, for letting him fling himself out into the night over the trees with a bounty on his head. He wanted to retch his guts out, but he just stood there. It occurred to him then that he hadn't eaten in over 48 hours, or slept. Had he even had water? The tremor in his hands was starting to make sense. I talked to the paramedic on the way here. He's probably going to need surgery to set his collarbone, assuming that it is broken, of course. He's going to go straight to radiology, then to surgery. If nothing else is wrong, he'll be in recovery within a few hours. The hospital is pretty busy right now, so they said it might take a little longer than it normally would. I imagine he'll be on IV fluids for the night at the very least, but they're going to need empty beds, so They'll be eager to discharge him to Chio's care. We'll probably be able to leave tomorrow morning. Hizashi spoke up from behind him, their voice small and hoarse, as if holding back tears. He didn't know how to respond to that, so he didn't. He took shaky steps out of the back of the ambulance and stood at the door leading to the hospital. Sho? Hizashi called out to him again. They sounded worried. They stepped around so that they were in front of him and studied his face before trailing their eyes down his body as if checking for injury. You're shaking, they observed. He didn't respond. Have you slept? They asked. He shook his head. Jeez, Sho. Okay, let's go get something to eat and find somewhere to wash off your face. I assume that's Nem's work? He nodded. Yeah, you look like a completely different person. I think Izuku would rather you look like shit than whatever this is. They noted with an apologetic cringe. He huffed out a breath somewhere between amusement and offense. He knew he looked ridiculous. Then we can find some corner for you to pass out in. I'll wake you up when they get Izuku into a room. The other students? You haven't slept in over 2 days. Someone else can handle them. I'm sure Hawks is diligently corrupting their minds right now. It's over, baby. They're safe. We can rest. They insisted, looking him in the eye as they gently laid a hand on his shoulder. Part of him crumpled like a wet paper towel under the reassurance, but he was still in public, so he just closed his eyes and took a moment to steel himself. All right. Food. And passing out in a corner. He could do that. Probably. The hospital lights felt like what Hitoshi imagined experiencing a flashbang at close range would be like. Every glimpse of fluorescent bulbs that peeked out from behind his eyelids was like getting a dagger to the cornea. And he was pretty sure someone turned his skull into a pressure cooker when he wasn't looking. Even still, the sensation was a welcome distraction from his current circumstance. Aizawa had been pulled away the moment they got to the hospital, and he knew his mom was here now. But he didn't want to think about that. They were waiting for a CT scan to make sure he didn't have a brain injury, but the nurse had assured him that it was exceedingly unlikely that his own quirk could have hurt him to that degree. Of course, it was also exceedingly unlikely that his quirk had even done what it had done tonight. It had felt different. There were multiple times when he knew that his control should have been severed, but it wasn't. And he had no clue why. He had been working on holding his connection over people during the training camp, but he hadn't gotten past the point of holding on beyond a moderately strong nudge to the shoulder. Izuku's standing injuries should have been enough physical stimuli to knock him out of the mind control. But they weren't. Maybe it was adrenaline or hysterical strength, but something about that didn't sit right with him. No, it was something else. However, he could barely think right now, so the mystery would have to remain just that, a mystery. He was trying to force the train of thought as the painkillers started to kick in. But unfortunately, his mom seemed to notice his steadily increasing lucidity. Toshi, what the hell happened? What did you do? She asked quietly but frantically. All the guilt he was trying his best to ignore hit him like a freight train. I'm sorry, he gritted out. I know, she replied too coolly to be a reassurance. I had to save him. Sorry. He tried to justify. The tears he had been holding back began to fall freely down his cheeks again. Midoriya? You went after Midoriya? He nodded with a grimace. Did you... Is he... She trailed off. We got him, he replied with a smile that was undercut by tears. His relief that Izuku was safe now was irrevocably mixed with the look of furious betrayal and grief that Hitoshi had last seen on his face. Oh my God, Hitoshi! Oh my God! she whispered with no small amount of horror in her tone as she pulled him into a gentle hug. Even after everything, she was still so careful not to hurt him. He could feel her shaky breath. He knew she was crying, but he still couldn't bear to open his eyes for more than a second, so he just held her right back. Shota didn't sleep until Izuku was finally put up in a room for the night, at which point he pulled a chair up to the kid's bedside, rested his head just below where Izuku's hand lay against the sheets, and passed out in less than 30 seconds. Hizashi wasn't surprised. They both looked awful, and he was sure he didn't look much better. He'd only gotten a few fitful hours of sleep in the hotel, but it was leagues better than the nothing Shota was working with. He could tell that leaving the kid with them went against every fiber of his being, but he had taken care of his other students dutifully. He was a good man. Hizashi just wished he treated himself with the same care that he afforded others. Nomori had pulled his hair back into a tight French braid. He looked sleek and elegant at the press conference, but after the flight with Hawks, he couldn't be called elegant by any stretch of the imagination. The braid was probably the only thing saving his hair from being one giant mat right now. Izuku's hair had not been quite so lucky. It looked like it had been pulled up into the semi-loose bun he normally kept it in, but it had been thoroughly tossed around. The tangles appeared to be holding it up more than the hair tie was at this point. They stood up and flagged down a nurse in the hall to request one of those shitty, flimsy combs hospitals passed out to patients. While they waited for the poor excuse for a comb to be delivered, they started on Shota's hair. The braid had done enough to make it manageable by hand, and Sho hardly moved a muscle as they unwove the strands. When it looked to be around its normal levels of musk, they pivoted their attention to Izuku. It took him nearly 3 minutes just to extract the hair tie, and he was able to work the mess into manageable sections by the time the nurse returned with a comb. He let himself get lost in the repetitive motions of detangling while he listened to the sound of Izuku's heart rate monitor and Shota's slightly labored breathing from where his face was smushed into the mattress. They were okay. It was over. They were safe now. Wherever it was that Izuku had been faded away from him, and the misty plane he was in before blinked in and out of his consciousness sluggishly. He saw the figures from before, but they were barely anything more than distant blurs of color. He cried out at the sight of the tall streak of yellow. He tried to claw his way toward the figure, but everything was like sand between his fingers, and he was so damn tired. Time and distance were nebulous concepts here, but by the time the misty plane faded away for good, he felt like he hadn't even made it an inch closer. He blinked his eyes open in reality to the sensation of his hair being gently messed about. He was in the hospital. His body didn't hurt anymore, so he figured the floaty, distant feeling he was currently experiencing could be attributed to drugs, though he's sure that wasn't the only culprit. He had been tuned out of nearly everything since the moment he saw All Might collapse. He wondered how long it had been, but he realized that he didn't actually care. He didn't care about much of anything right now. Mike and Eraser were here, and they looked awful. They were talking to him. He figured he should probably care about that too, but he didn't. He felt hollow, but not nearly as numb as he wished he was. Mike was wiping tears off his face that he hadn't even realized had fallen, and Eraser was holding his hand. That was kind. The man wasn't very tactile. He didn't need to do that. He was about to pull his hand away, but Mike used the hand that they had on his cheek to pull his attention toward him. "Can you eat something?" They signed as best they could with one hand. The thought made his stomach roil. He hadn't eaten in probably 2 days now, right? He should eat. But he'd gone longer without food before. He'd be fine. He shook his head. Izuku knew what loneliness felt like. He didn't have a single living thing that gave a shit if he lived or died for years. He knew he had hardly ever been less isolated than he was now, but he still couldn't shake the bone-deep, soul-crushing sense that he was alone now, completely and irreparably alone. All Might was gone. He watched him die. He felt him die. His absence ached like a phantom limb he hadn't even known existed until it was gone. Eraser pressed the call light on his bed, and a nurse came in to check on him. He knows they asked him questions, and he's pretty sure he answered them, but he couldn't remember a damn thing after they left, beyond the fact that they had been there. It was probably for the best. He didn't want to be here, and barely being present was better than sitting through each agonizing second. Shota almost preferred it when the kid was unresponsive. Whenever someone spoke to him, he'd stare at them blankly for what felt like hours before replying succinctly and with no intonation. It was like someone else was using his body to talk. There was no trace of the kid Shota knew in his stiff movements and stilted speech. He had seen Izuku in shock before, but not like this. He just kept staring at the wall, barely even blinking, no matter how many times they tried to get him to rest. Every half hour, the nurse would come by to check on him, and they'd have the same conversation. "Hello, Midoriya. It's Nurse Kawata. How's your pain?" she'd ask. He'd slowly turn his head to her, stare, before blinking owlishly for a moment, and reply, "It's fine." He'd say, perfectly intelligible and void of any emotion. "Good. I've got some Jell-O in my cart. Do you want some?" she'd ask patiently. Izuku would stare at her again with no expression for a few seconds and say the same thing he did last time she asked. "No, thank you," he'd say without even the hint of the stutter Shota had come to expect. Nurse Kawata would smile and say, "Okay," before glancing at his vitals and taking her leave. Then Izuku would go right back to staring at the wall. Occasionally a tear or two would slide down his cheeks, and Hizashi diligently wiped them away with his thumb. Somewhere around an hour and a half into this routine, Izuku spoke for the first time without prompting. "I felt him die," he announced into the silence of the room. He was still steadfastly looking at the wall. Shota glanced over at Hizashi just as they did the same in return. They were biting down on a frown again, with their brow furrowed. He didn't have the faintest idea how he was supposed to respond to that, so he just squeezed the kid's hand. The pressure caught Izuku's attention, and he looked down to where their hands were joined with confusion, as if he had forgotten Shota was there at all. He shifted his gaze up to meet Shota's eyes, and he fisted his unoccupied hand into the fabric of his hospital gown, just over his heart, before he spoke again. "It's cold," he said. Those words were the first ones to hold any emotion. They were quiet and strained. He sounded like a child much younger than he was. The room was stuffy and hot. The air conditioning was no match for the summer heat outside. There was no way he was actually cold. Shota could feel how warm his skin was. Of course, he knew that the temperature of the room was not what Izuku was referring to. Shota's heart ached to take that feeling away, but he couldn't do anything other than sit there in it with him. When Izuku's focus returned to the wall, Shota looked back over to Hizashi. They were wiping away their own tears on their sleeve as they reached out to dry Izuku's cheeks again. Nurse Kawata continued her rounds on the hour, and Izuku still didn't take the Jell-O. A few minutes after she left, Shota considered tracking her down and just giving the kid the Jell-O in hopes that he'd eat it eventually. Izuku hated for things to go to waste, especially food, and if they opened it and set it in front of him, There was a non-zero chance he'd eat it out of pure guilt. It wasn't ideal, but the kid's blood sugar had to be deplorably low right now. He was about to get up and do just that when there was a courtesy knock at the door. He thought the nurse had read his mind for a second, but a man who Shota didn't recognize opened the door. It wasn't the doctor they had briefly spoken to when they brought Izuku to his room. Hello, I'm Dr. Yokota. We have Izuku Midoriya listed as Toshinori Yagi's next of kin. Is that correct? The man asked. The tears that had just begun to run dry started welling in Izuku's eyes again. He looked at the man, but he didn't say anything. I don't think now is the time for this. Hizashi started, not bothering to keep the irritation out of his tone. We already reached out to his emergency contact. We just wanted to let you know we've gotten him stable for now. He's not out of the woods yet, but things are promising. The doctor pressed on. Izuku sat there frozen as his heart rate monitor picked up with pace rapidly. Shota activated his quirk, held Izuku's hand tightly, and pressed his free hand against the kid's chest before he got the chance to process what the doctor had said. Hizashi was quick to catch on and grabbed Izuku's other hand before he could rip his own IV out of his arm. He looked up at them fearfully for a split second before his expression settled on anger. Let me go, he demanded. Get him a wheelchair. He isn't going to calm down, and he's already been sedated today. Shota ordered the doctor while Hizashi did their best to calm the kid down. I don't know if security will allow, the doctor tried to explain. Make it happen. Shota cut him off. The man left the doorway quickly after that. Izuku was in complete hysterics, but he was weak and exhausted, so he wasn't putting up much of a fight. I saw him. I don't understand. He was with the rest of them. I saw him there. He has to be like, please, I need to see him, please. Izuku babbled nonsense and begged them through his tears. Izu, sweetheart, we're going to take you to him, okay? Just breathe. Breathe with me, kiddo. Come on. Hizashi answered him with their hand back on his cheek, guiding him to focus on them. Even with how exhausted he was gripping Shota's hand hard enough to hurt. He was furious with that doctor for handling the situation so poorly. He had the passing thought that if that man gave Izuku hope just for it to be taken away again, Shota was going to put him in the damn ground. End of chapter.